I'm going to level with you. It's challenging to get in any way excited about the RTX 5070. Let's put it this way. Take the RTX 4070 Super. Actually a pretty nice GPU, right? Priced at $600. Now imagine a year later, Nvidia releases pretty much the same GPU with a $50 price cut and calls it a 5070. Well, that's okay, I guess, but it's really hard to get enthusiastic about it. Of course, with this particular product, you do get DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, and that has good utility, except that the effectiveness of multi-frame generation diminishes the less processing power is available to it, meaning fewer options when compared to, say, 5070 Ti or 5080. And well, there are other problems too. The oddities of the Blackwell architecture remain present and correct here. On 5070 Ti upwards, this resulted in less than stellar gen-on-gen gains. And with the 5070, those oddities present as an actual gen-on-gen regression against the 4070 Super. Not for every game, but it is there. And even when it is faster, we're mostly talking about 6 to 8% faster, which isn't exactly game-changing or indeed exciting in any way. Nvidia faces other problems too, beyond the reports of black screen issues, missing ROPs and the like. AMD has announced two GPUs, 9070 and 9070 XT, extrapolating out from their benchmarks. Potentially, the 9070 not only has more memory than the 5070, but more performance for the same sticker price. Yes, even with ray tracing. Meanwhile, pay a $50 premium and you get an AMD GPU that is basically as potent as the much more expensive 5070 Ti. So if you're watching this review on day one, the day I posted it, you'll probably know that 9070 and 9070 XT are embargoed until tomorrow, so we can't talk about numbers there. But everyone will be talking about AMD's answer to Nvidia's 50 series lineup, let's just put it that way. And I'm not sure it's going to be particularly great news for Team Green. I have to admit though, the RTX 5070 is more potent than I thought it would be based on its specifications, and here's why. From Blackwell so far, typically we've seen broadly equivalent performance per CUDA core compared to the outgoing Ada Lovelace architecture. Blackwell uses more power, which does seem to account for performance uplifts from the new cards versus their 40 series counterparts. But here's how the specs compare between 4070, 4070 Super and 5070. There are 6,144 CUDA cores with the 5070, an improvement over the 4070's 5,888, but not exactly a huge boost, right? Then along comes 4070 Super with 7,168 cores. Now, based on what we know about Blackwell so far, the 4070 Super should be a fair bit faster. However, the 5070 has more memory bandwidth thanks to GDDR7 and a higher power budget. But still, even with that in mind, it is hard to see it beating 4070 Super, and yet with some exceptions and some of those regressions I was talking about, it does. And of course you can overclock it too. Let's take a look at clocks and power draw then, plus a touch of overclocking, which I'm representing here with the power budget set to 110%, plus 350 megahertz to the core, and plus 500 megahertz to the memory. 5070, 5070 Ti and 4070 Super all seem to operate at much the same clock speeds overall, with the 5070 consuming around 5% more power than 4070 Super. The 5070 tops out at around 213 watts on average here in Black Myth Wukong, with 3.1 joules per frame, up against the Super at 3.2 joules per frame. Overclocking takes us north of 3 GHz for a 7.4% performance uplift at the cost of an extra 7% in power, but that's still 3.1 joules per frame. There's no crazy inefficiencies in using overclocking here, though I did note that the Founders Edition card did get noticeably louder. On the next tier up, however, the 5070 Ti is 20% faster and is actually more efficient at 2.9 joules per frame. Now let's look at Cyberpunk 2077 in Psycho RT mode, which isn't hugely impressive. The 5070 draws 12% more power than the 4070 Super for just a 2 percentage point performance advantage, though overclocking does help matters. An 8.8% increase in performance over stock translates to 11% more performance over 4070 Super. And again, overall efficiency on the new card doesn't change. 5070 Ti is 30% faster here for just 13% more power, so it's clearly more efficient. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition has caused problems for all iterations of Blackwell cards seen so far. The difference being that subpar performance increases on all other 50 series cards we've seen so far translates into like-for-like performance across the entirety of the bench run. The difference being that 5070 is using 10 to 11% more power, making it less efficient. And this is really not impressive. Again, it takes an overclock to pull the 5070 clear, where we gain an 8.4% advantage. 5070 Ti, 23% faster, but it's using just 10% more power in this example. A gut feeling here is that the 5070 and this configuration of the GB205 processor aren't particularly efficient compared to prior generation NVIDIA, and clearly not as efficient as GB203 in the RTX 5070 Ti. And similar to 5070 Ti and 5080, I can't help but wonder whether core clocks are being limited here, as the picture does look rosier with overclocking in place, and Blackwell does seem to easily operate at 3.0 to 3.1 GHz. Now let's dig into more general benchmarks, and we'll kick off with Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, a banana skin game for Blackwell. Typically, it seems to run under par compared to Ada, and in this case that translates into an actual win for the RTX 4070 Super, which at 1440p here delivers a 3% win. Regression from gen to gen is really not a good look, and there's a similar effect at 1080p actually. 200 more of your US bucks notionally gets you a 5070 Ti, which is 24 points to the better. Well, we can't talk AMD today, but I would expect to see big price cuts on 7900 XT, which is 11 points clear of 5070. And now let's look back at older 70 series cards. 5070 is 14 points ahead of the 4070, rising to 56% clear of the 3070, and there's a 2.5x performance multiplier against the 2070. So clearly, if you've got an older card, you're going to be seeing a big difference with the new one, right? Cyberpunk 2077 in Psycho RT mode sees a mere 2% bump up from 4070 Super, while 5070 Ti powers ahead with a 30 percentage point lead. But this game isn't so kind to RDNA 3, meaning that the notionally discounted RX 7900 XT has just 76% of the performance of the RTX 5070. But well, you know, things may well change once the RX 9070 comes along, and of course, MSRP on the 9070 XT is just $50 more. Looking back at prior 70 series cards, we're 20% ahead of the RTX 4070, 40 points clear of 3070, and there's a whopping 3.1x performance increase over the 2070, which seems to be suffering from both RAM and compute deficits. Dying Light 2 in RT mode does kind of like Blackwell actually, but the 5070 can still only deliver a 5-point lead over 4070 Super, while the 7900 XT has 88% of 5070 performance. RT really isn't a strong suit of prior generation RDNA 3, but even so, it's not that far behind the 5070 here. And of course, we should expect big changes ahead with 9070 and 9070 XT. The more expensive 5070 Ti yields a 26 percentage point lead, so proportionately there is more value from the non-Ti 5070 here. Looking at prior generation 70 class NVIDIA, 25 points clear of 4070, rising to 65% ahead of the 3070, and there's another 3.1x performance multiplier against RTX 2070. I mean, there's general dissatisfaction with GPU prices, and I get it, right? But let's remember that that 2070 was only $20 cheaper than today's 5070. Not one of NVIDIA's finest hours. F124 next, all RT features deployed, settings maxed. Yes, it's another Blackwell banana skin here, with a 4070 Super delivering a 5 percentage point lead. What this also means is that the 5070 Ti 31% ahead, and even the 7900 XT delivers a 20 percentage point lead. All is clearly not well with this one. All of this translates into a 10% advantage over the 4070, which isn't particularly amazing. But there's clearly a problem with the older cards, perhaps because of the 8 gigs of frame buffer memory. 2.8 times performance advantage over the 3070, rising to a 4.2x boost compared to 2070. And weirdly, some horrific stuttering on the 3070 there, which seems to affect all resolutions, but also, weirdly, does not impact the RTX 2070, which has the same 8GB of frame buffer memory. I mean, let's put it this way. If your focus is narrowed to just NVIDIA cards, and you've traditionally bought 70 series offerings, but not the 4070 Super, well, the gen-on-gen uplifts do look pretty good, particularly from 20 and 30 series. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle next, which demands a card with hardware-accelerated ray tracing features. Again, nothing awe-inspiring here, with a 3-point lead over the 4070 Super, while Radeon RX 7900 XT ekes out a 3-point win of its own over the 5070, taken in average across the bench, of course. Scalability is odd on this one, with the 5070 Ti only offering up an 18 percentage point lead when MSRP is 36% higher. Looking at prior generation NVIDIA cards of the same class, we've had to cut back texture pool settings to medium for the 3070 and 2070 just to get it to run. And even so, 5070 commands a pretty substantial lead. 53% ahead of 3070, rising to a 2.4x performance boost over the 2070, which despite the texture quality drop, still exhibits pretty poor frame pacing there. Up against the 4070 non-super, a 22-point advantage to 50 series here. Let's look at some rasterization highlights now. The RTX 5070 fares better against 4070 Super in Black Myth Wukong, where I'm logging a 10% performance lead with a bit of a disappointing 19-point advantage for the 5070 Ti, which of course has an extra 36% on its sticker price. I expected better from 7900 XT here, bearing in mind AMD's rasterization prowess, but it only musters 95% of 5070 performance, and I kind of thought it would be better. On the prior generation group test, the numbers do look better than many of the previous results, with a 28% lead for the 5070 over 4070, rising to an impressive 75 percentage point advantage over 3070, and there's a 2.6x performance boost over 2070. Forza Horizon 5 continues to throw up some baffling results, but here it seems to aid Blackwell's cause as the 5070 outscores 4070 Super by 17%, which, let's face facts, it's a big win compared to some of the other results we've seen. 5070 Ti underwhelms again in this one with just a 14-point lead, while the 7900 XT pretty much on par with 5070s. The new card's only 1% faster, taken as an average across the whole sequence. The news is rosier with the gen-on-gen, on-gen results. A 33-point lead for 5070 over 4070, rising to 85% over 3070. And you're getting a nice 2.6x frame rate boost for 5070 over 2070. Seriously, if you're still on Turing, 40 series or 50 series offers a big improvement to the gaming experience. And remember, there's new AMD offerings en route, which we'll be seeing very soon. Okay, let's talk about DLSS 4 next, as at this point, the 5070 needs all the ammo it can get to fight off the outgoing 4070 Super. And, of course, there's this, NVIDIA telling the world that 5070 can offer 4090 performance. That means DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, and that's already a bit of a house of cards for NVIDIA, bearing in mind prior results in like-for-like testing on much more capable Blackwell cards. The FPS can match and indeed exceed 4090, but latency definitely cannot. But continuing on with our prior 50 series tests, let's begin with Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K with RT Overdrive. I'm going to skip the native resolution testing because, well, RT Overdrive needs DLSS Super resolution, where we have a 40 FPS average with a 51 millisecond latency. 4x multi-frame gen takes us up to 122 frames per second, which is nice. but PC latency rises up to 72 milliseconds, so a 21 millisecond deficit up against super resolution. That's moving somewhat into my perception that something doesn't quite feel right in the controls versus the frame rate that I'm seeing on screen. But let's be clear here, it is still playable, especially with a controller. Up against the 1490, however, running with 2x frame gen, 4x MFG on the 5070, well, it offers 96% of 1490 frame rate. But yeah, the PC latency at 72 milliseconds is 33 milliseconds higher than 1490. So again, I can't honestly call this ballpark 1490 performance. Cyberpunk base latency isn't so bad though, so it's a good basis for using multi-frame generation, but Alan Wake 2 is problematic. The benchmark here gives us a 32.5 FPS frame rate with just DLSS super resolution, along with an 83 millisecond latency. 4x MFG gives a 3.35x frame rate uplift, which is great, but average latency in the benchmark rises to 108 milliseconds, which is not great. Base latency there is just too high. Switching to 4090 comparisons, 4x MFG on 5070 musters 90% of 1490's frame rate with 2x frame gen, but it's the lag that's the killer. A 67 millisecond average on 4090 is already high, and having already established a 4x MFG latency of 108 milliseconds, that's a 41 millisecond penalty. So yeah, again, not great, not really comparable to 4090, despite what the frame rate numbers might say. So the 4090 performance claims are, from my perspective, dead in the water really, but that's not to say that you can't use multi-frame generation with 5070 with good results. By dropping to 1440p, which, let's face facts, is a better match for the 5070, and using Alan Wake 2 with high rasterization settings and low RT with direct lighting active, I had a pretty good time actually, even in really heavy areas of the game like this one. And with the DLSS in Transformer model mode at the balance settings with 3x MFG, I achieved an experience that would be a great fit for a high refresh rate 1440p screen. I used 3x MFG here instead of 4x and dialed back settings in order to claw back as many milliseconds as I could in terms of PC latency. 4x, it's weird. There isn't actually a huge boost to latency, but I could start to feel the controls as being a touch more sluggish. And since frame rate was already high anyway, I stuck to 3x MFG. Average latency across all of my gameplay in this clip came into about 53 milliseconds, significantly better than the maxed experience on 4090 at 4K. So yeah, tweaking settings can definitely improve the experience, right? Certainly in latency terms, even if you are losing some of the bling. I chose a similar strategy for playing Cyberpunk 2077 with RT Overdrive. DLSS again at 3x multi-frame gen mode with balanced super resolution settings using the Transformer model. With average PC latency at 45 milliseconds, I probably could have pushed further, but the experience felt good and looked great. What's kind of nice here is that with both Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk, a $550 GPU is providing a transformative experience compared to consoles, even PS5 Pro. DLSS 4 and higher level ray tracing are playing a big part in that, of course, and as long as settings are judiciously chosen, multi-frame generation technology works well. So features are important then, and Nvidia is pulling ahead of the competition even as they are starting to catch up in terms of prior generation Nvidia features. Transformer model DLSS super resolution, well, that's a game changer. And in a world where high refresh rate monitors are only getting more and more popular, multi-frame generation definitely has a role to play. But ultimately, pure performance from the hardware, well, it seems to be the case that as new Blackwell cards appear, the gains versus 40 series refresh are diminishing to almost nothing, and that's not good. Regressions gen on gen, that's actually really bad. I mean, we saw it before to a certain extent with 4060 Ti versus 3060 Ti, but that was mostly on 4K max settings or other scenarios ill-suited to that level of card. But here there are scenarios where 4070 Super can beat 5070 at 1440p or even 1080p, and that's more than a bit troubling, especially when we test relatively fewer games than many other outlets. So I would expect to see more of these regressions when you take a look at other reviews from other channels. So collating all of our 1440p benchmarks, we can use 5070's $550 MSRP to calculate value in the form of dollars per frame. But before I list my caveats and concerns, here's an overall look at how the 5070 compares to a range of GPUs across a range of resolutions, expressed in the form of percentage differentials collated from all of our benchmarks. But yeah, dollars per frame metrics. I hesitate to show those results, bearing in mind that 9070 and 9070 XT reviews are coming imminently, and we should expect the concept of price versus performance to be disrupted based on AMD's promises. And then again, there's also the concept of whether MSRP is actually relevant anymore. Anyway, here's how the table looks. A top 10 based on cards from 70 series or equivalent up. The table kind of flatters the 5070, I guess, but the bottom line is this: an aggregated performance uplift of 4% over 4070 Super at 1440p, combined with a circa 8% reduction in MSRP, puts the 5070 at the top of the table. 4070 Super is beaten only by the 5070 Ti in the overall value stakes, followed by the 1-2 of 7800 XT and perhaps surprisingly the 7700 XT from AMD. Now, this doesn't reflect current retail prices, of course, nor availability. It's actually extremely hard to get any prior generation NVIDIA offering at this point, while AMD prices vary dramatically. But it does give you some idea of how the concept of value is scaling across time as we move from generation to generation. Cost per frame is reducing, but not in a particularly quick manner. But as I said, expect the RDNA 4 cards to disrupt this table somewhat. And so in summary, 5070 is, well, I guess kind of underbaked. A card of this class should have more memory at the very least, but 12 gigabytes it is. Underwhelming, I'd say. It should not be outperformed by its predecessor in any reasonable gaming scenario, and yet it is. You kind of hope that gen-on-gen gains should improve as we go down the stack, yet the 5070 is palpably worse than the 5070 Ti, which didn't really set the house on fire there either. Value is indeed increasing with the cheaper cards, but not to a dramatically meaningful degree. Looking at the positives, I mean, I like the Founders Edition board. Nicely made, reasonably quiet, high quality materials. I like DLSS 4, even if its application requires a bit more care than higher spec cards. But otherwise, I guess I remain unmoved by this release and kind of think NVIDIA should have done better. But that's all from me for now, so allow me to switch into autopilot mode for this last part of the video. Liking, subscribing, sharing, bell ringing for notifications on new DF content. This is all very good stuff, as is the DF supporter program, of course. Your support makes what we do possible, and what you get in return consists of high-quality video downloads of everything we've done since late 2016, early access to content that includes DF Direct Weekly and other videos too, and of course weekly updates from the team. It's all good stuff. But that's all from me on this one. So, as always, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.